Hello, everybody, and welcome to the 2022 One Sustainability Conference, our annual global sustainability conference. I'm Stefan Pogacek, an ESG strategist and advisor focusing on sustainability risk management for small to medium-sized companies. We now have the pleasure to welcome Danielle Bars to One Sustainability. Danielle will tell us more about how businesses are greening their energy mix. And Danielle, thank you so much for making the time to join us today, and welcome to One Sustainability.
Thank you so much for the introduction, and thank you for having me. So my name is Danielle Bars, and I am the Director of ESG and Sustainability Solutions at EisnerAmper. EisnerAmper is a full-service accounting, tax, audit, and business advisory firm, and we serve both private and public companies. So to kick us off, there are two major ways to reduce carbon emissions. Number one is we can improve energy efficiency. And number two, we can replace fossil fuels with renewables. So starting with energy efficiency, this achieves a carbon emission reduction essentially by decreasing the amount of electricity a building or facility uses. So for example, when you swap out an appliance or a piece of equipment with a more energy efficient version, then that piece of equipment physically uses less energy. And that is regardless of where that energy comes from. It is literally using energy more efficiently. So if we make the assumption that this building uses energy sourced from fossil fuels, then by decreasing the amount of energy that any given appliance or piece of equipment uses within that building, we are also then decreasing the amount of carbon being emitted into the atmosphere as a result of using that appliance or piece of equipment. So let's say you didn't replace that piece of equipment, but instead you started powering that equipment using renewable energy instead of fossil fuels. That appliance still requires the same amount of electricity to run, but now you're powering it using solar energy, for example, instead of a fossil fuel like gas. The benefit here is that even though you did not technically decrease the amount of energy that particular piece of equipment uses, the energy source, let's say solar, for that appliance or piece of equipment does not in itself emit carbon. So we are focused here on reducing carbon emissions through smart energy management. Now, we can probably make the assumption that buildings and appliances and equipment need some energy to operate, which means that achieving carbon zero is essentially impossible using energy conservation measures alone. So with energy efficiency, you decrease carbon emissions by decreasing the amount of energy used to power your equipment. Leveraging energy efficiency in this particular way will also reduce operational costs and how much you spend on your utility bill because you're paying for less electricity. With renewables, you decrease carbon emissions by using an energy source that does not emit carbon at all. So that means regardless of how much energy is used within a building, if everything in that building is being powered using renewable energy, you are still emitting net zero carbon. And the reason we talk about carbon so much is that because it is the #1 contributor to global warming. To give you kind of a lay of the land, with the current electricity demand, powering the United States alone would take more than 7 billion individual solar panels. And this would require around 22,000 square miles worth of land, which for reference is around the size of Lake Michigan. And the problem is we don't have that kind of space. Additionally, although the cost of solar has come down significantly, we're not yet at price parity with fossil fuels across the board. For some companies, switching to renewable energy might come with an increased cost. And even for companies that are able to achieve price parity here, you would still be paying for the same amount of electricity as you did before switching to renewables, because you haven't necessarily reduced your energy consumption. This is important because this is precisely the reason why most companies address energy efficiency first, essentially bringing down the total amount of energy the company uses and then covering the rest with renewables. If you have access to solar, then procuring solar for your company might come down to a single PPA, which is a power purchase agreement. And retrofitting an entire building, on the other hand, to make those buildings more energy efficient can sometimes be a lot more time consuming and require more effort than simply switching to renewable energy. So let's dive in a little deeper to some smart energy management tactics. So the energy efficiency pyramid essentially shows the priorities that many companies will adopt before even considering a renewable energy solution. So if we start at the bottom, an energy analysis or an energy assessment allows a business to evaluate energy usage and consumption and what that business needs before even implementing anything. Energy audits are a great way to help businesses better understand their current energy consumption and any inefficiencies that can potentially be improved upon. Additionally, it will give you a cost estimate for implementing these changes, which is extraordinarily useful, especially as we are seeing this increase in the number of both private and public companies that are integrating sustainability and environmental, social, and corporate governance, also known as ESG considerations, into their financial statements and annual reports. If we start going now up the pyramid, energy conservation tends to offer a really good return on investment. And that is because it is based on very simple everyday practices. So these are things like reminding employees to turn off the lights when leaving a room. It could be adjusting thermostats or changing weather or temperatures. And building automation systems, or BAS, can automate a lot of these things, which is really handy. For example, you can leverage a building automation system to shut down certain pieces of equipment that may usually run overnight, but that you really only need during the day. And that saves a ton of energy, which subsequently saves a lot of money on operational costs. If we move to energy efficiency, so energy efficiency measures will include things like switching out old appliances for more energy efficient versions. Energy Star is a very good example. Energy Star appliances, they consume less energy. And then other things like switching out incandescent lights for LEDs is a big one. And the great thing about building automation systems is that you can automate and integrate many of these things to make the entire system or the entire factory or the entire building more efficient. So now we go to time of use management, and this is all about demand charges. So many companies will see a demand charge on their electricity bill or a peak demand charge, which means that you are getting charged a higher rate to cover the cost of your utility needing to have enough capacity to meet customer needs at its peak. So when that need is the highest, that utility needs to be able to have enough capacity. And so with this, companies can reduce their energy bill by adjusting, again, when certain pieces of equipment run. So if you do run during what's called off-peak hours, then the demand charges are going to be lower than if you are running that same equipment during on-peak hours or when demand is very high. So you're essentially using less electricity during peak demand times when everybody else also wants to use that electricity. And this is a great technique to save companies money, but it also reduces the strain on our electric system as a whole, because it reduces how much generating capacity the utility needs to meet demand. Now we sort of get to renewable energy. And so when you completely reduce your energy consumption as much as it can possibly go, this is when companies start looking at covering the rest with renewable energy. The main thing about renewables is that, of course, it reduces emissions by replacing current electricity sources, which are often fossil fuels, with renewable alternatives such as solar and wind. So some things we can do with renewable energy is that we can use a PPA, which is a power purchase agreement, to lock in electricity prices. We can do this with renewable energy, but it also mitigates the financial risk associated with our changing market and allows more security in our renewable energy investments. Things like integrating on-site renewables, such as rooftop solar, is another way. And in this case, electricity will essentially be transferring directly from solar panels to your building, and that bypasses the electric grid entirely. And so we talked about that strain on the electric grid. This is a really good way to help with that as well. This also reduces operational costs because once you've hit your payback period for the solar system install, you're essentially not paying for electricity anymore. That is, whatever is covered by the solar panels, you're not paying for anymore because you're not going through the utility itself. Now, many companies will continue to stay connected to the grid in case of emergencies, blackouts, things like that, in which case they would only pay for what they use. And the rest of the time, they are pulling from this on-site solar system, for example, rooftop solar. and then potentially using energy storage as well, so batteries, to help store some of that generating capacity for use at a later time, which really helps with renewables because of that kind of generating fluctuation. And then other things like leveraging RECs, which are renewable energy credits, we can look at as well. And they're a little more inexpensive. They're an inexpensive alternative to achieving those emission reduction targets that we're seeing a lot lately. So I wanted to touch on a few trends that we're seeing right now in energy management. The IRA, or the Inflation Reduction Act, is a big one that just passed, and it pours nearly $370 billion into subsidies and tax credits and into energy security and climate change programs. This includes everything from EVs, electric vehicles, to renewable energy, and it even includes things like carbon capture and storage. The IRA is projected to reduce the total GHG emissions, greenhouse gas emissions in the US by 40% by 2030. The reason why this is so important is because it essentially puts the US back within shooting distance of its Paris Agreement goals. So the US has some emission reduction goals, and this is going to go a really long way towards ensuring that companies have the tools and resources they need to get us to where we need to go by 2030. Within the IRA, another consideration here is the extension of the ITC, which is the solar investment tax credit. And this is really important because it was actually in the process of getting rolled back by the previous administration. And so this is we're starting at 30% credit. And it also applies to energy storage, applies to a lot of things, solar arrays, battery retrofits. And this is going to be very, very important in essentially launching or accelerating the solar industry as we know it. This is a 10-year extension. Again, it starts at 30%. The credit starts at 30% of the cost of the installed equipment. This then steps down to 26% in 2033 and then 22% in 2034. It's a 10-year extension. Within the IRA, we're also looking at a lot of additional funding for GHG emissions reporting, so greenhouse gas emissions and carbon reduction. The IRA is providing around $5 million to the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, which supports what they're calling the standardization and transparency of corporate climate disclosures. And this is great because it's signaling to companies that quality control is going to be really important, and especially quality control for these non-financial performance indicators. So when we talk about ESG, environmental social governance, these are non-financial KPIs and key performance indicators. So energy efficiency and even things like waste and water management will all come into play here. And this is going to become increasingly significant for companies of all sizes. So a lot of this reporting started with larger public companies, but it is now coming down the supply chain. And these larger public companies are saying, if you don't have these goals, or you're not looking at emission reductions, or you're not looking at energy management, and your competitor is looking at those things, then they're just not going to work with those companies. And so companies are really making sure that they're on top of the GHG emissions reporting, and especially looking at the SEC's climate proposal. So the SEC's proposed climate rule, which is now closed for comments, received over 14,000 comments. So it took a little while to work through. But the reason why this is significant is because the SEC has decided to use the TCFD tier, which is the task force for climate-related financial disclosures. The reason why this is so significant for energy management is because the SEC climate rule focuses on GHGs. So specifically scope 1 and 2, there was a little bit of pushback when it comes to scope 3, which is your supply chain emissions. So we'll see how that goes, but definitely going to need to start looking at scope 1 and 2. And the SEC is leveraging the TCFD as this framework. And so you're seeing the 4 focus areas there, which is governance, strategy, risk management, and then metrics and targets. And this is going to allow everyone, investors, customers, the general public, to have a more consistent reporting scheme, especially when it comes to greenhouse gas emissions. So this is one of the many reasons why companies are very much focusing on energy management right now. Great way to reduce energy consumption, operational costs, but also a really great way to reduce your carbon emissions. And so this is going to be important for a lot of reasons. And again, things like the IRA are really stepping up to try to make this easier for companies. And then there are also some more specific laws, regional laws. One of those is Local Law 97, which is specific to New York, but we'll see if something like that passes elsewhere. And that was part of the New York City's Green New Deal, and it essentially sets building GHG limitations, and that's by 2024 for all buildings larger than 25,000 square feet, which is most of the buildings in New York. And so a lot of companies with buildings in New York are definitely looking towards Local Law 97 to make sure that they are in compliance and that they're not going to end up getting fined because of these very, very strict limits. And again, that goal is to reduce carbon emissions and make these buildings more energy efficient. So I believe we have just a few minutes left. So I wanted to leave you with a few considerations to when you're looking at the integration of renewable energy, or when you're following companies who are looking at the integration of just energy management in general. So some things you can do, we talk about looking at your electricity bill. And this is looking at how many kilowatt hours, kWh, are being used in a month. You can compare the month over month energy consumption and year over year energy consumption to see if the energy conservation measures that your company's been implementing are actually doing what you want them to do, or actually reducing that consumption and reducing that emissions. Building management systems or building automation systems that I mentioned are going to come into play here for sure, because it automates the whole process. And many companies are leveraging M&V, which is measurement and verification, to basically use as a benchmark. Again, this is just making sure that the ECMs, the energy conservation measures that are being implemented, are actually doing what you want them to do. And then it gives a really great idea of which pieces of equipment or which appliances or which areas of a building are really going to be using more energy than they need to be. Additionally, you can look at what the really big energy consumers are, and you can look at HVAC, so air conditioning, heating, ventilation, refrigeration is going to be another one. And essentially looking at the efficiency of all of these existing appliances and pieces of equipment. So of course, older ones are usually less efficient. And this is where things like those Energy Star appliances are going to come in. Again, looking at HVAC systems and then also inverter systems is something that a lot of companies are looking at when it comes to building retrofit. So this is for existing buildings. And then really just understanding, we talked about peak demand, how your power consumption varies throughout a typical 24-hour period. This can be carried out by installing a power monitor, which monitors real-time power consumption. Again, we go back to those building automation systems, data management software is going to come into play here. And then kind of looking at power purchase agreements again. So you can have on-site and off-site. There are two main power purchase agreement types. Your physical power purchase agreement would be, for example, if you are installing rooftop solar, and that will come straight from the solar panels to your building. And that bypasses the electrical grid, which again puts less strain on the grid, what we talked about a little. So that's going to be really helpful to really just bypass the grid in general. Now, some companies, most companies will stay connected to the grid in case of emergencies. But then there's also a VPPA, which is a virtual power purchase agreement, and that's essentially a financial agreement. So if you cannot install on site, if you don't have enough roof space, or if you can't find a way to procure that using a physical PPA, then you can look at a financial agreement or a virtual PPA to do that for you as well. And there we go. Good chiming. Came right back.
Okay, Danielle, outstanding. I wonder if you could briefly comment about net zero commitments and your firm's role in helping companies understand, especially those companies who haven't made that net zero commitment yet, but want to make that net zero commitment. What steps that you've outlined in your presentation do you start with when advising these companies to create that net zero commitment that has real teeth?
That's a great question. I would always advise our clients to start with integrating their ESG or their sustainability objectives in their overall mission statement. So first and foremost is really figuring out why you're doing this. A lot of this really needs to come from leadership. It's important for leadership to be engaged. Employees want to work for companies that are looking at this kind of thing. And our clients want to work with partners that are helping them look at this kind of thing. So really making sure that there is a why. And then the first deliverable that you want really is a gap assessment. So there are many ways of doing this. You can use a sector-specific materiality assessment. So SASB is a great one, which is the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board. And that is a great resource for companies trying to determine which ESG metrics are going to be most important to their business. And if carbon or greenhouse gas emissions is within that, then that's really something that SASB can tell you because it's industry specific, and that's a really great resource for that kind of thing. And then if you want to go industry agnostic, you can look at resources like GRI, which is the Global Reporting Initiative. And both of those things will give you a really, really great place to start.
Great. Danielle, thank you so much. Wish we had more time to dive into this very important topic, but we really appreciate your taking the time to share this information with us.
Thank you so much for having me.
Okay.